Hello and welcome to New England Authors with Kameel Nasr. It's so good to have you. We explore the richness of our area here with wonderful experts and lots of good stories. And today we have a real expert, Eugene Soltes. Well, welcome, Eugene.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, and you wrote this wonderful book about white-collar crime, why they do it. First of all, nobody knew what white-collar crime was. There was somebody named Edwin Sutherland, who coined the expression in, I think, the 1930s, 1939, was it?
Exactly.
Tell us the story.
It's pretty remarkable. In the early 20th century, the idea that a business person could engage in some type of conduct in the course of their profession that would be criminal was a pretty kind of crazy idea.
Yeah.
People didn't really think of that. People thought of street crime, murder, burglary. Yeah. That's the kind of thing you go to prison for. It's not things that occur in the business suites. Edward Sutherland, a sociologist, coined this expression in a talk, otherwise an obscure talk he gave one evening, which actually the New York Times picked it up. But just to show you how slowly things changed, even by the mid-20th century, when Attorney General Kennedy actually sought to prosecute a number of people, GE, Westinghouse, big firms, when ultimately several people were prosecuted, successfully in this case, one of the defense lawyers actually argued that the reason his client should not go to prison is not because he didn't do it, but because you wouldn't send someone like that, a pillar of the community, to prison with pimps and prostitutes.
Right.
That's just something you didn't do. We've come a long way since then.
So you're the Jarkowski Family Associate Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. And what got you to study this kind of crime?
Actually, I'm a quant by training. I'm a financial economist. This project actually began, incidentally, one evening. I was up late running some regressions, and I came across a show on MSNBC called Lockup. It's a clever cross between a reality TV show and a documentary.
Yes.
And they were interviewing people that primarily engage in violent street offenses. And I was watching this show. This is back in 2008, 2009. And I was thinking about the people in my world, former executives, who were actually now in that same position, but had fantastic upbringings, went to the best schools, had plenty of wealth, didn't have those same circumstances. And I imagined, well, what would they say if I had a half an hour with them?
Yeah.
And so that night, out of total personal curiosity, this wasn't actually a scholarly endeavor by any means at that point, I sent a couple letters off in the mail, and 2 months later, I started to receive some responses. Some answering my questions, others saying, effectively, I've plenty of time on my hands now. I'd be happy to chat if you come visit me.
You sent letters to people who were in jail.
Yeah, pen pals would be the best way.
Yes. Now, your book is definitely a scholarly book. There are 46 pages of bibliography and endnotes, but it's very readable because you tell story after story of these people, and there's a slippery slope aspect to a lot of your crimes. Tell us, how do people who are executives, who don't need the money, how do they end up stealing money?
What I describe in the book is it's not so much a failure of reasoning, being strategic, but actually it's a failure of intuition. At the time they're engaged in many of these offenses, they don't actually see the harm associated with it.
Yeah.
And I know to a lot of people, as I say that might be hearing me express that seems pretty outrageous, because when we read about these cases in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, it's absolutely obvious to us the extraordinary harm on employees and investors and others. But if you actually think about the types of offenses that occur in a business suite, the victims themselves are very, very far removed. Physically, psychologically, even temporally. Easy instances of insider trading. At the time one is actually engaged in those kind of dealings, you don't really have that gut feeling that you're harming a person. In fact,
yes, as opposed to going into a convenience store with a gun. Exactly. Yeah.
I spent a lot of time with people in here, and I never was once in a room concerned that if I turned around, they would actually grab my wallet and take the money I have in it. No. But in a number of instances, with some of the investments I had, actually some of the people I'm interviewing harmed me actually far more than I ever carry in my wallet.
Yes.
But there's something very different, and I don't think anyone in here would ever grab my wallet and take the cash out of it, but they didn't feel that sense of wrongness causing the harm that they ultimately did on the stock price and other effect that would harm people's retirement accounts.
Yeah. Now, what were you aiming to do with this book? Were you aiming to change something, expose? What were you aiming to do?
I wanted to, in a way, humanize many of the individuals because
yeah, absolutely, you did that. Yeah.
I think one of the challenges is that we're rightfully very, very angered by their actions. Absolutely, and I think in virtually all the cases, the sanctions are entirely appropriate. But at the same time, I don't think that anger necessarily leads to a very good understanding. And to the extent that we want to design better ways of approaching to try to mitigate and prevent these types of actions, we need to think of more creative ways. A lot of times what we approach from a sanctions perspective is we give longer and longer sentences, thinking that will scare people from engaging in these types of actions. But I genuinely believe there's not one person in this book that at the time they were engaged in this kind of misconduct, they thought they were going to go to prison. And it's not because people at the Department of Justice would be ineffective in prosecuting them. It's the fact that people that are making millions of dollars a year, that go to the best schools, that are working at the best firms, that are on the cover of Fortune, you just don't think that's a place that you would end up. Prison's for bad people who do bad things, not me and my colleagues and the people that go to great business schools.
Now, the attitude has changed over the years since 1939, when nobody considered white-collar crime. But still, very few people go to jail, right?
It's still hard. President Obama was once, after the last financial crisis, was put on the defense, and he was forced to defend and say that not everything that's unethical is illegal, which I think is the sentiment that kind of reflects the challenge that we face, that there are a lot of ways you can do things that are absolutely both deceptive and incredibly harmful. But because of how our regulation is both set up, there are loopholes, but also we have a very, very high bar when it comes especially to criminal prosecution. I think rightfully so, we need to provide evidence for that. I think that's both a fair and adversarial system. But the challenge is in a lot of corporate boardrooms, that's hard to trace down that evidence. The conversations and the pieces that we rely on to prosecute people just are simply not there.
Now, you from reading your book, I kind of got two kinds of people. People who embezzle and steal money to make themselves richer, and CEOs who do something for their company to try to make their company look better, especially at the end of the financial quarter or whatever. Are those distinctions real? I mean, these people who are trying to do something for their company, they're not out to buy another yacht, right?
I think you're spot on with this distinction. I think one of the challenges, especially when we start thinking about financial fraud, I mean, it sounds really quite egregious, and it is. But simultaneously, the mindset for many people while they're engaged in it isn't to make themselves necessarily a bit more money. Many of these people are quite wealthy already.
Right.
But they actually are tied up with, they want this firm to succeed. And they see themselves helping their employees keep their jobs. They see helping prop up the stock price of the firm. They actually see themselves potentially even helping shareholders by maintaining the success of the enterprise. And obviously that will all unwind quarters or years down the road when that fraud ends. But the time it's actually going on, you can in some sense be deluded into thinking what you're doing is not only not harmful, but actually beneficial.
Yes. Yes, very interesting. We're talking with Eugene Soltes, and his book is Why They Do It. And this is New England Authors. We're fascinating conversation about white-collar crime. So, do you think that the top of our society committing criminal acts sets a precedent for the rest of the society?
I think there actually is a sense of leadership and how that actually culturally pervades into others. Piece of work I actually recently finished, we find that actually the most significant factor which seems to encourage or will predict people's likelihood of potentially be willing to engage in misreporting is cultural norms. And so if you're surrounded by people who find things as acceptable or not so egregious, you generally adopt that practice also. I mean, a classic example that I think many people can relate to is actually use tax. This was actually something recently Amazon Supreme Court actually addressed, that most people actually, when you ordered something out of state, thought that was a clever discount. So you buy a book online from New York, have it shipped to Cambridge, and you save 6%.
Right.
You were supposed to be claiming that. The evidence actually is quite overwhelming that people generally didn't do that.
I didn't even know you were supposed to claim that.
And Amazon, and for a long time, Amazon and a lot of retailers actually used that as a kind of a clever discounting, which actually put local retailers at a severe disadvantage.
Yeah, but I think that's just changed recently. So now you talk about this this kind of, when you go in to buy a car, all right, you're a dealer and I'm the buyer, and we kind of lie to each other. You say, oh, this car cost me $10,000. I can't sell, I could sell it.
Can't give you one penny less.
I can't give you one penny. No, that's a lie. Okay. Yeah. And then I come out and I say, equally lying, oh, I won't pay a penny over $8,000, right? And then you say, well, you know, we're going to be taking a big loss on it, but we'll give it to you for $9,000. And then, you know, oh, I can't do anything more than $8,500. Anyway, we haggle about this, and that's acceptable. That's if you went to a flea market and you didn't haggle, there would be something wrong with you.
This is just how negotiation in that market operates. Exactly.
Right. Now, if I did that with bond prices, then it's illegal.
And this has been a case which has gone prosecuted, actually been overturned, the Jesse Litvak case. Some markets, this type of negotiation or puffery is on one hand, I'll say tolerated because there are many people, or at least some, that were doing it. But certainly when prosecutors took a look at this, actually thought that this is not how that market should operate. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that the norms of the market can evolve such that selling cars in that way are acceptable, but selling bonds are not. And that's something where I don't think we actually have great ways right now of actually always creating the appropriate cultures within these institutions to support the kind of conduct that we necessarily want.
Now, you don't talk about political crimes. Is there a correlation between the two?
There's there's bribery, which actually starts to get close on a number of the dimensions. The kind of quid pro quo, I expect I'm going to give you something, I want something back in return in the process. And I will say most of the actual prominent prosecutors in a number of the cases are actually many of the people that we actually see currently actually in prominent roles. Andrew Weissman, for example, who actually was leading the Enron investigation and prosecuted Andrew Fastow, is now one of the senior leaders in the Mueller investigation.
Oh, I see.
So there are connections.
Yeah. Now, the stereotype that we have is that Republicans are big, tough on crime, and Democrats are a little bit looser on crime. What about white-collar crime? Is there a difference between the Republican and Democrat, how they prosecute?
In terms of I'll say the kind of crime that we all agree on when it comes to pump and dump schemes, Ponzi schemes, I have a hard time thinking that there could ever be any distinction between them.
Right.
I think where there maybe are differences in terms of the kinds of resources that should be expended on these types of investigations. Certainly right now, if you look at the Department of Justice and the SEC, not to say that they are underfunded by any means, but at the same time, there are certainly calls by certain types of certain politicians that they could certainly use more funding, and with more funding, they certainly would do a more aggressive job in a number of instances.
Do you think that there's a lot more like insider trading than actually gets reported or caught?
Tremendous. I mean, some of the work that I'm doing now is in corporate compliance systems, and if one looks at the whistleblowing hotlines of firms, what you find is it's not an issue like bribery or even these kinds of civil offenses once every a couple years for a firm. When we're talking large firms, we're talking several issues per day in many instances. And I think the appropriate way to think of crime, and I'll say crime, I'm using in the broad sense, is not does it happen at all at large firms, but trying to make it so it's low in magnitude. It's not millions of dollars, but it's someone taking a couple hundred, and that you're keeping it so it's not 30 issues a day, but it's 5 issues a day at a lot of large firms.
It would seem to me, if I knew that the company was going to have a great quarter or bad quarter, I might tell somebody in a little bit, or change my own portfolio just a little bit. It's very tempting, right?
It's very, very tempting. And I think the real challenge is smart people find clever ways where you think, well, I can't trade in that stock. I know that, but what happens if I trade in a competitor stock? Or what happens if I find some kind of proxy? And maybe that low pull works once or twice, but then nothing happens.
Yeah.
And then you decide to get a little bit more brazen, then you make that trade a little bit larger.
Yes.
And then you say, well, that's imperfect. I want to get a little bit closer. And then you decide, I'll just buy a couple options.
Yeah.
And you see really, really smart, really brilliant individuals doing things that, with the benefit of hindsight, seem so extraordinarily stupid. And I mean, I see examples like Sam Waxel. He was the executive related to the Martha Stewart case. I mean, he's a genuinely brilliant person. The first time I met him was actually down the road here at MIT when he was speaking at a conference after he was released from prison. But he was starting a new firm because he had so much time during his prison sentence to actually read scientific journals that he created a new enterprise. It shows you that kind of intelligence, but simultaneously, he also, after he found out a trial failed, he called his daughter and told her to dump her shares. I mean, something that's not even good fraud, not good or bad, but that's not even clever. That's the kind of thing that a summer intern working at the SEC is going to pick up. I
see. So I'm glad you brought up Martha Stewart, because I think she was the only woman that you mentioned in the book. Is this a male crime?
There is. So the book uses he quite deliberately. Across almost any statistic one wants to look at, you will see that it's predominantly men. Now, part of this might reflect the fact that still in many boardrooms, there's still obviously a dominant male presence.
Sure.
But obviously, that's changing over time. If one looks at some of the statistics, 20 to 30% of female managers and leaders at many of these firms are women. But if you look at the number of people that actually then engage in misconduct, it's still not women. And I think this raises a number of fascinating questions, whether, as some psychologists would argue, women are more empathetic and have, on average, a better ability to actually see the consequences of their actions.
I see.
Or it's the fact that almost all these offenses are, I'll say, it's a little bit of the old boys club. We're all sitting together and think alike, to the extent we actually have someone that thinks differently. And this could be someone, obviously, based upon gender, but other attributes could create that too. You're less likely to have that type of groupthink occur, which leads to the kinds of cataclysmic events that arise in this book.
Okay, we're talking with Eugene Soltes, and this is a wonderful discussion about white-collar crime. So this brings us to a question. Is criminality, do you think, innate?
When it comes to white-collar crime, I'm actually pretty skeptical of that explanation. I guess there's a couple ways to look at it. First, I think broadly these are sociological phenomena, cultural. I mean, many of the crimes, the easiest is bribery. That wasn't illegal. Actually, it was tax deductible in most places around the world up until 3 decades ago. So that's not something we could innately have any kind of proclivity or strong feeling about. It's just something we've changed the regulation around. Even someone in my book, one person I do devote a whole chapter to is Bernie Madoff, who is unlike the other individuals I spend time describing in my book, who I think just has an inability to empathize with others, even people he's close with, but certainly his investors. I still don't think in his case he was destined to become a white-collar criminal. It's simply when a matter of circumstances arose in which there was a hard route, which was potentially closing down his fund and exiting, or the, quote, easy route, which was to effectively paper this over and start engaging in fraud. He was able to do that without a strong degree of remorse, which just one thing continued to the next. But no one in here, I think, was born to be in this book.
So, but you also talk about a very interesting thing is that corporations are a new phenomena. They've only been with us for a little while. Could you elaborate on that? What's the history?
This is something, I mean, it's changed so dramatically that if one goes back just a couple hundred years, most firms were small businesses in the genuine way that you and I would hold the shares, and so you wouldn't steal from it because it would be stealing from one pocket and literally putting in the other.
Yeah.
And what's dramatically changed over time, for a lot of fantastic reasons, this is how we have a lot of the entrepreneurship that we have today, that we've separated ownership and control.
Yeah.
That the people who manage enterprises are different than the people who own them. And for all the benefits that this creates, this also creates all the challenging opportunities that we see in here, that you have these problems where the people actually operating the firm have both an opportunity to want to take a little bit more, and the people who actually own the firm don't really know everything that's going on with those who manage it. And so it creates the kind of the initial stew to allow misconduct to be more profitable.
But a lot of that comes from the investment habits have changed, because at one time people bought shares of IBM or General Electric, and they held them for they held them for their lifetime. You know, now some people hold the shares for 15 minutes. A long-term trade would be 30 days or something like that. You know, so it puts a lot of more pressure on the CEO, right?
Pressure on the CEO, but it's also pressure on fund managers, because even though I think there's a lot of well-intentioned mutual fund managers that generally, when they say they want to hold and think long-term, 5 and 10 years, they genuinely want that. The hard part, and I'm sure many people can relate to this, is if you look at your mutual fund and 2 quarters in a row it's underperformed in the S&P 500,
right.
What do? You don't say, well, this is a great manager and he told me he's investing for 5 years, so I'm going to hold this. What you do is you sell it and then you chase the next fund that the last 2 quarters looked great. And so I think we all unfortunately fall into that trap a little bit, which is why we see the executives, but why we see the fund managers. We all want a little bit more on our returns every period.
Yeah.
It's it's human nature. It's something that's really hard to combat.
So can I ask you one other thing? Cybercrime. Do you consider that white-collar crime?
It's interesting. We're starting to get on the cusp, because many of the people who are engaged in cybercrime, I think, would have been the street criminals that are now adopting what things look like white-collar crime, because they're adopting more sophisticated tools. But the brilliance of that strategy is now, rather than stealing from one store or one pocket, now you have the chance to reach people all across the world, and we're seeing that with a lot of these coin creations that pop up that are nothing more than kind of pump and dump schemes that are arising, fly-by-night operations.
Yeah. Well, what's a pump and dump scheme?
Oh, pump and dump is where you have a stock. It's generally typically of a low value, or some of these new coin offerings, where then someone comes in as a promoter and pumps that stock up, and people get excited because they see it go from 10 cents to $1. I mean, that's a huge return over a couple month period. And then immediately when it hits $1, the person who promotes it dumps their stock very, very quickly to unwilling people. Still profits quite heavily, but what happens to everyone else? They lose everything. There's no liquidity in the market, and it descends to nothing.
Okay, so there's one very interesting point in your book. Immoral is not illegal. Can you elaborate on that?
I think that's probably the hardest point, especially when it comes to white-collar crime, for the public to understand. That I think we want those things to be aligned, and maybe that is the goal of regulation over the long run. But in any given point, there's a lot of things that I think as the public we would find deceptive, things that are unsavory, but are either tolerated in certain markets, and we simply don't have regulation designed yet to actually prevent it. And so I think this is the cat-and-mouse game between what goes on in industry and actually how regulation's designed.
Yeah. Do you favor better regulation?
I think I create a smarter regulation.
Smarter.
I think unfortunately what we find is that in some instances, firms, financial institutions spend literally billions of dollars in aggregate on compliance systems. many of these things are check the box. They're not doing anything useful.
Yeah.
We should get rid of those. Simultaneously, there are things that they ought to be investing in that are costly and significant, better data analytics, better proactive ways to actually detect, which I actually think we should design more regulation to not only encourage and incentivize, but maybe in some instances actually mandate. So we need to change that balance.
So this has been a very fascinating discussion. I wonder if in the last few seconds you can give us some possible ways that we can protect ourselves from fraudulent investments. How can we really know what we're investing in is accurate, and so on?
I just finished with a set of co-authors a paper looking at a large online bank. So this would be like an E-Trade, a Ameritrade, where many of us trade our stocks. And we were looking at who invests in these pump and dump schemes. Things that are, let's say, are hazardous to our investing health.
Right.
I thought initially it would be pretty anomalous. It turns out approximately 5% of all investors, so we're talking of a sample of over 100,000 people, 5% of people are investing in one of these things. What we find is that many people are investing not because they're being duped, but because I think they see an opportunity. And while I'm sympathetic to that in some instances they do profit, in the long run, everyone loses out on these. I mean, virtually everyone does poorly.
Yeah.
And so this is the hard thing, is how do we train ourselves? And I think this is actually a forcing mechanism to not chase when we see the story on CNBC or the latest fad, that we don't buy into that and actually chase that, because the overwhelming evidence suggests trading is hazardous for our health, and chasing returns, pump and dump, they are pump and dumps. And Bitcoin it may be just the latest, one of the latest versions of that, where a lot of people, I remember my Thanksgiving dinner when it was like this. And I was actually thinking by Christmas, maybe even I should have bought some of this. I saw what was happening by that point. Wow, did I miss out? And then sure enough, what we now a couple months later look at, it's actually back down even lower than it was before. Hazardous to one's health to follow those fads.
Well, it's been so nice to have you with us. We're talking with Eugene Soltes, author of Why They Do It, about white-collar crime. This is New England Authors. We broadcast here around New England. We record here in Cambridge. Remember, watch locally. Thank you.